Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the question of the sex harassment allegations that the Prime Minister quite rightly referred to, just to put on the record, I'm happy to meet with the Prime Minister and all party leaders to discuss this. We need better protections for all in this House. This House must involve workplace trade unions in that, but it's also incumbent on all parties to have robust procedures in place to protect and support victims of sexual abuse and harassment. And I join with the Prime Minister in sending our solidarity to the people of New York and their Mayor, Bill de Blasio, for the appalling terrorist attack that took place yesterday. I hope, Mr. Speaker, the whole House will join me in paying tribute to two former Labour colleagues who sadly passed away this week. Candy Atherton, the member for Falmouth and Camborne, and Frank Doran, the member for Aberdeen North. Both did enormous good work at opposite ends of the UK to diligently represent their communities and constituencies. They will be sadly missed by all of us, particularly in the Labour Party, who they served so well for their entire lives. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, the Labour government intervened through HMRC to shut down an Isle of Man scheme used to import yachts into the European Union and thus avoid tax. A similar scheme has recently been exposed relating to the import of business jets into the Isle of Man. So can the Prime Minister assure the House that HMRC investigates these new allegations diligently?
The Right Honourable Gentleman has made a number of references in his question, and I will address all of them. On the first point, it is absolutely essential, and he is right, that we have processes, that political parties have processes to deal with allegations of misconduct. Also, that obviously we have the Ministerial Code and proper investigations take place against the Ministerial Code where that is appropriate. But I believe it is also crucial for everybody working in this Parliament, be they working for a Member of Parliament, for the House authorities or a journalist working in this Parliament, that there are proper processes in this Parliament for people to be able to report misconduct and for that to be dealt with. And I think that is very important, and I'm grateful to him for saying that he will meet with me, and I hope other party political leaders. I see the leader of the SNP is nodding his head at this point, to look at this particular issue. Can I also join him in paying tribute to both Frank Doran and Candy Atherton? Frank Doran was first elected in 1987. He served 2 separate terms as the MP for Aberdeen, chaired the Administration Committee for 5 years, was a tireless campaigner for safety in the oil and gas industry, and I'm sure everybody will recall the commitment with which he served in this House and join me in offering condolences to his family and friends. And Candy Atherton, of course, was first elected in 1997 when I was first elected. She served for 8 years as a Member of Parliament, but she was a strong campaigner for women's rights and disability issues and continued to champion those causes on Cornwall Council after she had left this House. And once again, I'm sure members across the House will join me in offering my condolences to her family and friends. The Right Honourable Gentleman talks then about tax avoidance. I can assure him that where cases are referred to HMRC in relation to tax avoidance, they do take those seriously, they do look into those measures seriously. We have taken action collectively as a government over the last few years, since 2010 when we first came in, and we've secured almost £160 billion in additional compliance revenues since 2010 through a number of measures that we have taken to ensure that we clamp down on tax evasion and avoidance.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, 957 business jets in the Isle of Man seems a bit excessive for any island anywhere, and I hope it's investigated and due tax is collected from those people that are trying to avoid it. Because estimates of the scale of tax dodging range from 34 billion, which is around the size of our school's budget, to 119 billion, which is the size of the NHS budget. The Isle of Man VAT avoidance allegations are part of a wider leak from the Bermuda-based law firm said to be on a similar scale to the Panama Papers. Will the Prime Minister commit the HMRC to fully investigate all evidence of UK tax avoidance and evasion from this leak and prosecute where feasible?
I had given the right honourable gentleman an assurance in my first answer that HMRC does take these issues very seriously, does investigate and does take action, and where appropriate, tax loopholes are closed. What is important is that if we look at the record that we have, we see, I mentioned the 160 billion in additional compliance revenue since 2010. We've announced or implemented over 75 measures since 2010 to tackle tax avoidance and evasion. The right honourable gentleman referred to one that had been done by the Labour government. We have been continuing to act on this particular issue, so we will be raising billions of pounds more as a result of that. But I reassure him, I think most people would recognise that HMRC actually does rather want to collect tax. That's its job, and it does look to make sure it can do so as much as possible.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's rather strange then that Britain reportedly has blocked a French-led proposal which would have placed Bermuda on the European Union tax haven blacklist. Perhaps the Prime Minister could explain why that would be the case. The Panama Papers exposed many wealthy individuals and big businesses who avoided tax through offshore trusts. Labour backs any necessary changes to toughen our laws against aggressive tax avoidance. And just yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we tried to strengthen legislation on beneficial ownership of trusts with amendments we placed to the Finance Bill. Why did the government vote against them?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that he raises the issue of the British overseas territories. In fact, this government has taken action in relation to those British overseas territories, action that was not taken by the previous Labour government. So this is, if he says to me that this whole question of tax evasion is something that needs to be constantly looked at and government needs to be prepared to act, then my answer is yes, we are and we will.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, there's a strange kind of pattern here, because in 2015 alone, Conservative members of the European Parliament voted against 5 reports to introduce methods of fighting tax avoidance and evasion. And last week, HMRC admitted that multinational companies avoided paying 5.8 billion taxes in 2016. And despite this, HMRC is currently cutting another 8,000 staff. So can the Prime Minister assure the House that in the upcoming budget, instead of more cuts to HMRC, they'll get more resources to tackle the scourge of aggressive tax avoidance and evasion?
I have reassured the right honourable gentleman that HMRC is acting, has been acting since this Conservative Party came into government in 2010, and will continue to act. But of course, the right honourable gentleman, in asking these questions, might want to reflect on why it was before the dissolution of Parliament earlier this year, it was the Labour Party that stopped and refused to support tax avoidance, anti-tax avoidance and evasion measures brought forward by this government. His party stopped it.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, my question was why Conservative MPs opposed what Labour was proposing yesterday. So, Mr. Speaker,
he can be Prime Minister if he wants.
last month's European Parliament Committee of Inquiry, set up in the wake of the Panama Papers, claimed that the UK is obstructing the fight against tax dodging and money laundering. And just last week, the EU's Competition Commissioner announced an inquiry into UK taxation rules that may have institutionalised tax avoidance by multinational corporations. Isn't the Prime Minister concerned that vital revenue is being lost to fund schools and hospitals? Will she change the rules in the budget?
say to the right honourable gentleman, we have taken an extra £160 billion in additional compliance revenues since 2010. And he comments on measures that were being proposed this week. As I said in my previous answer, we would have had more tax evasion, anti-tax evasion measures in place if the Labour Party had not blocked them before the last election. This party in government has been not just acting in the UK. We have been working with the Crown dependencies, working with the British Overseas Territories, and we have been leading the world. It was a Conservative Prime Minister. It was a Conservative Prime Minister that put this on the agenda of the G7 and the G20 for international action against tax avoidance and evasion.
Mr. Speaker, if we are leading the world, perhaps she could explain how the amount of tax paid by the super rich in income tax has fallen from 4.4 billion to 3.5 billion since 2009. Earlier this year, the Public Accounts Committee said the HMRC record of getting multimillionaires to pay their taxes was, and I quote, dismal, and that the super rich were getting help with their tax affairs that is not available to other taxpayers. Our schools' budgets are being cut. More people waiting longer for treatment. More people...
Order! We do tend to have large doses of this overexcitement every week, but I just give notice that, as usual, I'd like to get to the end of the order paper and to facilitate backbench inquiries as well. So members are eating only into their own time. I've got all the time in the world. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, since members opposite get so excited, I must say it again. Our schools' budgets are being cut. More people waiting longer for treatment on the National Health Service. More elderly and disabled not getting the social care they need. Does the Prime Minister think it is acceptable that when it comes to paying taxes, there's one rule for the super rich and another for the rest of us?
The top 1% of earners in this country are paying 28% of the tax burden. That is the highest percentage ever under any government. And once again, the right honourable gentleman is wrong. Over the next 2 years, £2.5 billion extra is being put into our schools as a result of decisions taken by this Conservative government. But I'll tell him, he talks about spending on schools and hospitals. I'll tell him where the real problem lies. Today, we spend nearly £50 billion in payments on interest to those we have borrowed from as a result of the legacy of the Labour Party. That is more than we spend on the NHS pay bill. It is more than we spend on our court.
Order. The Prime Minister's answer will be heard. As I indicated, the question from the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, would be heard. And Mr. Gapes, you are a senior and cerebral denizen of the House. This excessive gesticulation is not good for you, man. Calm yourself. The Prime Minister.
We spend £50 billion on debt interest every year, payments to people we've borrowed from. That's more than the NHS pay bill, it's more than our schools budget, it's more than we spend on defence. That's a result of the economy we were left by the Labour Party in government. And what does the right honourable gentleman want to do? He wants to borrow £500 billion more that would make the situation worse and mean even less money for schools and hospitals.